The air in the terminal hummed with the kind of chaos only a Friday afternoon could muster. Travelers dragged suitcases across polished floors, their wheels squeaking like mice fleeing a sinking ship. Overhead, a garbled voice crackled through the speakers, announcing delays and gate changes, while the sharp tang of coffee and jet fuel lingered like an unspoken promise of escape. At gate 17, Jaden Brooks stood quietly, a lanky 19-year-old with a mop of dark curls spilling out from under a faded gray hoodie. His jeans were ripped at the knees not by design, but by years of wear, and his sneakers scuffed the tile with every nervous shuffle. In his hand he clutched a boarding pass, its edges already creased from how many times he'd unfolded it to check the seat. 1A. First class. A gift from his father Malcolm, who'd texted him that morning. "You've earned this. Fly proud." Beside him stood Ruby, his aunt and unofficial guardian since he'd moved in with her for college. At 40, she carried herself with the calm of someone who'd seen enough storms to know when to batten down the hatches. Her braided hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her soft brown eyes flicked between Jaden and the boarding line forming ahead. She adjusted the strap of her leather satchel, packed with snacks and a dog-eared paperback, and gave him a reassuring nudge. "First time's always the hardest," she said, her voice warm but firm. "Just breathe. You'll be fine." Jaden nodded, though his stomach churned like the propellers he could hear warming up outside. He wasn't used to this airport's fancy seats, the idea that someone might actually serve him a drink instead of him pouring it himself at the campus diner where he worked weekends. He'd grown up in a modest row house, the kind where the porch sagged and the neighbors knew your name. Flying first class felt like stepping into someone else's life, and the weight of it pressed down on him harder than the backpack slung over his shoulder. He glanced at the pass again. Brooks Jaden. Seat 1A. It was real. He belonged there. Didn't he? The gate agent, a woman with a tight smile and a headset dangling around her neck, waved them forward. "First-class passengers now boarding," she called, her voice cutting through the din. Jaden hesitated, but Ruby gave him a gentle push. "Go on, kid. That's you." He stepped up, handed over his pass, and watched her scan it. The machine beeped, green light flashing, and she nodded. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Brooks." Mr. Brooks. The title felt foreign, like a borrowed coat 2 sizes too big. Ruby followed, her own pass for 1B clearing just as smoothly, and together they walked down the jet bridge, the cool metal walls echoing their footsteps. Stepping into the first-class cabin was like crossing a threshold into a different world. The air was quieter here, scented with leather and something faintly floral, a stark contrast to the stale bustle of the terminal. Wide seats stretched out in neat rows, each with its own little universe of pillows and folded blankets. Soft lighting glowed from above, and a low hum of classical music played, soothing but unfamiliar. Jaden's eyes widened as he found 1A, a window seat with more legroom than his entire dorm room. He slid his backpack under the seat and sat, the cushion sinking beneath him like a cloud. Ruby settled into 1B, stowing her satchel overhead with practiced ease. "Not bad, huh?" she said, a grin tugging at her lips. Jaden managed a small smile. "Yeah, not bad." He fastened his seatbelt, the click loud in his ears, and pulled out his phone, scrolling aimlessly to steady his nerves. Around them, other passengers trickled in, businessmen in crisp suits, a woman with a designer handbag, an older couple whispering about their vacation plans. Jaden kept his head low, hoodie up, feeling like an imposter in their polished company. He wasn't loud or flashy. He didn't have a Rolex or a briefcase. Just a kid in thrift store clothes with a ticket he still couldn't quite believe was his. Then she appeared. Vanessa. She strode into the cabin like she owned it, her heels clicking against the floor with the precision of a metronome. Her uniform was immaculate navy blazer pressed sharp, name tag glinting under the lights, blonde hair twisted into a flawless chignon. Her face, though, told a different story. Sharp cheekbones framed a mouth set in a thin, judgmental line, and her blue eyes scanned the cabin with the cold efficiency of a hawk spotting prey. She greeted the businessman in 2C with a practiced smile, handed the woman in 3A a glass of champagne without being asked. But when her gaze landed on Jaden, the smile vanished. She stopped beside his row, arms crossed, head tilted slightly as if sizing him up. Her eyes flicked over his hoodie, his jeans, his sneakers, and the judgment in them was instant, palpable, like a slap before the hand even moved. "Is this your seat?" she asked, her voice flat but edged with something sharp. Ruby looked up, surprised, and reached for their passes. "Yes, ma'am. 1A and 1B. Here." She held them out, but Vanessa barely glanced at them. "This is first class," she said, louder now, as if Jaden hadn't heard the announcement. "For first-class passengers only." Jaden's stomach dropped. He felt the eyes of nearby passengers shift toward him, subtle but undeniable. "I know," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the heat creeping up his neck. "This is my seat." Vanessa's brow arched and she leaned in closer, her perfume sharp and overpowering. "Your seat," she repeated, sarcasm dripping from every syllable. "Kid, this isn't the bus. You don't just wander up here in those clothes and claim a spot." Ruby bristled. "Excuse me? His father booked these seats. Check the tickets." She thrust them forward again, but Vanessa waved a hand dismissively. "I don't need to see them. I've been doing this job long enough to know when something's off." She straightened, her voice rising just enough to draw more attention. "You need to move to the back. Now, or I'll have security sort this out before we even taxi." Jaden's hands tightened around his phone. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't arguing. But inside, his chest burned with embarrassment, with confusion, with the sudden sinking realization that she'd already decided who he was. Or who he wasn't. "I'm not lying," he said, louder this time, meeting her gaze. "This is my seat. My dad." Vanessa cut him off, snatching the pass from Ruby's hand. She held it up, squinting at it like it was a forged dollar bill, then with a flick of her wrist tore it in half. The rip echoed in the quiet cabin, a sound so final it made Jaden flinch. "Nice try," she sneered, tossing the pieces onto his lap. "Get up or I'll drag you out myself." The torn pieces of Jaden's boarding pass fluttered onto his lap like ashes from a fire that hadn't yet started. For a moment, the cabin held its breath, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the distant clink of a champagne glass, the faint rustle of a blanket, all drowned out by the sharp, ragged sound of Vanessa's disdain still hanging in the air. Jaden stared at the scraps, his fingers trembling as they brushed the jagged edges. Seat 1A, his seat, reduced to trash in front of everyone. His throat tightened, but he didn't move. Not yet. He couldn't. The weight of every eye in first class pinned him to the cushion, a spotlight he hadn't asked for. Ruby snapped out of her shock first. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she barked, her voice slicing through the silence like a knife. She lunged forward, half standing, her satchel tumbling to the floor as she reached for Vanessa. "That's his ticket. You can't just—" Vanessa spun on her, eyes blazing, and shoved Ruby back with both hands. The force caught Ruby off guard, sending her crashing into the armrest of 1B. Her elbow slammed against the metal with a sickening thud, and she yelped, clutching it as pain shot up her arm. The cabin gas beat a collective intake of breath, sharp and uneven, like the sound of glass about to shatter. Jaden's head jerked up. "Ruby!" He scrambled to help her, but Vanessa stepped closer, blocking his path. "Stay down," she snapped, her voice venomous now, no longer cloaked in fake professionalism. "Both of you. This stops now." Her heel clicked against the floor, a punctuation mark to her command, but Jaden wasn't listening. He pushed himself up, hoodie slipping off his head, curls spilling free as he faced her. "You can't do that," he said, his voice low but shaking with something raw. You can't touch her. Vanessa's lip curled. Oh, I can't. She reached forward, grabbing the collar of his hoodie, and yanked him toward her. The fabric twisted in her grip, choking him for a split second before he wrenched free, stumbling back into his seat. That's when it happened. The tray table beside him, still locked in place, held a steaming cup of coffee Ruby had grabbed from the galley pre-boarding. As Jaden fell, his arm flailed, knocking it loose. The scalding liquid arced through the air, a dark ribbon against the cabin's soft lighting, and splashed across his left hand. The pain hit like a freight train. Ah! Jaden's scream ripped through the cabin, raw and unfiltered, as the coffee seared his skin. He clutched his hand to his chest, the flesh already reddening, blisters bubbling up beneath the surface. Ruby, still cradling her elbow, lunged toward him. Jaden! Oh my God, are you? Her words cut off as Vanessa shoved her again. Harder this time, sending Ruby sprawling into the aisle. Her head grazed the edge of a seat across the row, and a thin trickle of blood slid down her temple. The cabin erupted. A woman in 3 dropped her champagne glass, the shatter piercing the chaos. Someone stop her, she shrieked. A businessman in 2C stood, fumbling with his phone, the camera light flashing as he recorded. This is insane, he muttered, his voice trembling. But no one moved to help, not yet. They watched wide-eyed, as if this were a movie playing out on a screen they couldn't pause. Vanessa towered over Jaden, her chest heaving, her face flushed with a mix of rage and panic. You think you can play me? She hissed, pointing a trembling finger at him. I'll have you both thrown off this plane. That's when the plane lurched. A sudden violent shudder rocked the cabin, the kind that comes with turbulence no one saw coming. Overhead bins rattled, a loose bag thudded to the floor, and the classical music stuttered, replaced by a low, ominous groan from the engines. Passengers screamed, clutching armrests, their composure crumbling like dry sand. Jaden, still gripping his burned hand, slid sideways in his seat, the belt digging into his hips. Ruby grabbed the edge of her chair, blood smearing her fingers as she steadied herself. Vanessa, caught mid-rant, staggered backward, her heel catching on the carpet. She flailed, arms windmilling, and crashed into the drink cart parked nearby. The impact was deafening. Metal clanged against metal. Glass bottles toppled and smashed, spilling gin and tonic water across the floor. Vanessa's head snapped back, striking the cart's edge with a dull crack. She crumpled, one hand grasping at her scalp, blood seeping through her fingers as she groaned. Help me, she rasped, her voice weak now, the authority stripped away in an instant. Jaden stared, his breath hitching, the pain in his hand pulsing in time with his racing heart. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel anger. Just a hollow, dizzying shock. Ruby crawled toward him, ignoring her own injuries. Jaden, look at me, she pleaded, her voice shaking. Are you okay? Your hand, he nodded faintly, though his vision blurred at the edges. It hurts, he whispered. But I'm fine. He wasn't fine. Not really. The coffee burn throbbed, a fiery reminder of how fast everything had spiraled. Around them, the chaos grew. A man near the back, slurring and red-faced, stumbled to his feet, clearly drunk. She's right, he bellowed, pointing at Vanessa's crumpled form. That kid looks like trash. Kick him off. His words sloshed through the air, sloppy and loud, igniting murmurs from others. A woman hissed, "Shut up!" But the drunk kept going, swaying as the plane rocked again. Another jolt hit, sharper this time, and the overhead lights flickered. A child in coach screamed, the sound piercing through the thin partition separating the cabins. The businessman with the phone cursed, dropping it as he braced himself. We're all gonna die because of this, he yelled, half to himself, half to the universe. Vanessa, still slumped against the cart, tried to stand, her legs wobbling like a newborn foal's. Blood streaked her blonde hair, matting it to her forehead, and her eyes darted wildly, searching for control she no longer had. Jaden's gaze locked on her, then shifted to Ruby, then back to the chaos unfolding around them. His burned hand throbbed, his ears rang with the shouts and the plane's groans, and somewhere deep inside, a spark flared, not fear, not surrender, but something fiercer. He didn't know his father was watching from 5 rows back, didn't know the storm was about to break wide open. All he knew was that Vanessa had lit the match, and now the whole damn cabin was catching fire. The cabin was a war zone of shattered glass and fractured nerves. The air reeked of spilled gin, burnt coffee, and the metallic tang of blood. The plane groaned under another jolt of turbulence, its frame shuddering like a beast shaking off a wound. Jaden Brooks sat slumped in seat 1A, his burned hand cradled against his chest, the skin blistered and weeping where scalding coffee had seared it raw. His breath hitched, each inhale a stab of pain, his dark curls plastered to his forehead with sweat. Beside him, Ruby knelt in the aisle, her own blood trickling from a gash on her temple, staining her fingers as she pressed a crumpled napkin to it. Her other hand gripped Jaden's shoulder, trembling but fierce, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Hold on, Jaden. Just hold on." Vanessa lay sprawled against the mangled drink cart, her blonde hair matted with blood, her navy uniform soaked with liquor and shame. She groaned, one hand clawing at the carpet, the other pressed to her scalp where a jagged cut bled freely. Her legs twitched, trying to find purchase, but she was a marionette with cut strings, broken, powerless, her authority leaking out with every ragged breath. The cabin buzzed around her, a swarm of panic and outrage. The drunk man in 4C swayed to his feet again, his voice a slurred bellow. She was right. Trash like him don't belong up here. His beer-soaked shirt clung to his gut, his finger jabbing toward Jaden like a loaded gun. A woman in a navy blazer and 3 shot back. "Sit down, you drunk fool." Her voice cracked, her hands clutching the stem of a broken champagne glass. The businessman in 2C fumbled with his phone, the camera light flickering as he muttered, "This is insane, going viral, oh God." The plane lurched again, overhead bins rattling, a loose carry-on thudding to the floor. A child's scream echoed from coach, piercing the thin partition, and the lights flickered, casting the cabin in a strobe of shadow and fear. No one had control, not Vanessa, not the passengers, not the trembling metal bird slicing through the storm. Then he stood. From row 5, a shadow unfolded, tall, broad-shouldered, deliberate. Malcolm Brooks stepped into the aisle, his dark suit untouched by the chaos, his face a mask of granite carved with cold fury. His eyes burned, twin coals in a furnace, and his presence hit the cabin like a shock wave, rippling through the noise without a single raised word. His polished Oxfords clicked against the floor, slow and measured, each step a metronome ticking down to judgment. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The air bent around him, the chaos pausing as if the plane itself knew something unstoppable was coming. Vanessa saw him first. Her head lolled against the cart, blood streaking her cheek, and her bleary eyes widened as he approached. She tried to speak, her voice a cracked rasp. I didn't mean, but Malcolm didn't stop. He stepped over the puddle of gin, glass crunching beneath his shoes, and halted just short of her crumpled form. His shadow fell across her, heavy as a guillotine, and her bravado shattered like the bottles at her feet. "You," he said, his voice low, sharp, a blade unsheathed. "You slapped my son." The words detonated in the silence. Ruby froze, her hand still on Jaden's shoulder, her mouth parting in a silent gasp. Jaden's head snapped up, the pain in his hand fading for a heartbeat as he locked eyes with his father. "Dad," he croaked, barely audible, his voice swallowed by the weight of the moment. Malcolm didn't turn. His gaze stayed on Vanessa, pinning her to the floor as if she were a specimen under glass. She blinked, her bloodied hand trembling as she pushed herself up an inch. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice rising, desperate. "He didn't look like." Malcolm cut her off, stepping closer, his presence a wall she couldn't climb. You didn't know he was my son, he said, each syllable deliberate. Or you didn't know what you were doing when you put your hands on him? His tone was calm, but it carried the force of a tidal wave held back by will alone. Vanessa's face flushed, then drained to a sickly white, her lips quivering as she grasped for an excuse. I thought he was sneaking in, she said, her voice breaking. His clothes, the way he acted, I thought he didn't belong. Malcolm's jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing in his cheek. Did you check his ticket? He asked, his calm unnerving like the eye of a storm. She hesitated, her eyes darting away, then shook her head, a faint twitch. I asked, but it didn't seem right, he pressed forward, relentless. Did you call anyone to confirm? She shrank back, her bloody hands slipping on the wet floor. No, I didn't think. Malcolm leaned in just enough to make her flinch. You didn't think? He echoed, his voice dripping with contempt. That's the problem. You looked at my son, and decided he wasn't worth the air in this cabin. You tore his ticket, pushed his aunt, burned him with coffee, and turned this plane into a circus. The cabin was a tomb now, every passenger hanging on his words. Vanessa's eyes darted around, seeking an ally, but found only stares, some shocked, some accusing, none forgiving. The woman in 3 gripped her broken glass, her knuckles white. The drunk man sank back into his seat, his rant dying in his throat, sobriety creeping in like a thief. The plane steadied for a moment, the turbulence easing as if bowing to the man in the aisle. Malcolm straightened, his gaze sweeping the cabin before returning to Vanessa. You chose wrong, he said, his voice final. And that choice ends here. He turned sharply, his suit jacket flaring, and pointed at a junior flight attendant hovering near the galley, her face pale with shock. You, he said, his finger a command. Get me the cabin phone. Now. She nodded, scrambling to obey, her hands shaking as she unhooked the receiver and thrust it toward him. Malcolm took it, his fingers steady as he punched in a Kodia private line etched into his memory from years of running the airline. The line crackled, then connected. This is Malcolm Brooks, he said, his voice carrying despite the low volume. I need the captain on this line, and I need ground security at the gate when we land. We've got an employee who's lost control of herself. Vanessa's head jerked up, panic flooding her eyes. Nopley's eyes. She lunged forward, clawing at the air, trying to stand, but her legs buckled and she slumped back, clutching her head. Blood smeared her fingers, her breaths coming in shallow, frantic bursts. Malcolm ignored her, listening as the captain's voice came through, clipped and professional. Mr. Brooks, we've been briefed. What's your directive? Malcolm's reply was steel. Relieve her of duty immediately. She doesn't speak to another passenger. She doesn't move unless I say so. And when we touch down, I want her escorted off this plane in cuffs if necessary. The captain paused, then. Understood, sir. She's done. Malcolm handed the phone back to the junior attendant, his movements precise, controlled. He turned back to Vanessa, his eyes boring into her. Get up, he said, his voice flat but unyielding. Move to the back. Sit there and don't make a sound. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air, but no words came. She dragged herself up, wincing as her head throbbed, and stumbled toward the rear of the cabin, her heels scraping the floor. Every eye followed her, a fallen queen stripped of her crown. Malcolm didn't watch her go. He stepped toward Jaden, his expression softening for the first time, though the fire in his eyes still smoldered. He knelt beside his son, his hand hovering over the burned flesh before pulling back. You okay? He asked, his voice quieter now, a father's concern breaking through the steel. Jaden nodded, though his hand trembled, the pain a pulsing drumbeat. It hurts, he admitted. But yeah. Malcolm's gaze flicked to Ruby, taking in her bloodied temple. You too, he said, a question in his tone. She managed a weak smile. I've had worse. He stood, turning to the junior attendant again. Get a first aid kit. Now. She nodded, darting off, and Malcolm scanned the cabin once more. The drunk man, now silent, stared at his shoes. The businessman's phone was back in his pocket, his hands clasped as if in prayer. The woman in 3A whispered to her neighbor. That's the word spread like wildfire. A murmur rippling through the Roseville. Malcolm Brooks, the man who owned the sky they were flying in. But Malcolm wasn't done. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a slim satellite phone, a relic from his early days when he'd built the airline from nothing. He dialed another number, his thumb moving with surgical precision. Ground ops, a voice answered. This is Brooks, he said, his tone clipped. I want legal on standby when we land. Full cabin footage pulled every second. And get me the head of HR. This isn't staying in the air. The voice on the other end hesitated, then. Yes, sir. Right away. He hung up, slipping the phone back into his pocket, and turned to Jaden. You did good, he said, his voice low, steady. You stayed calm. That's strength. Jaden looked up, his eyes glassy with pain and confusion. I didn't know you were here, he said softly. Malcolm's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile. I don't announce myself. Keeps people honest. He glanced at Ruby. Or exposes the ones who aren't. The junior attendant returned, a first aid kit in hand, and Malcolm took it, kneeling again to tend to Jaden's burn. He worked silently, tearing open a gauze pack, his hand steady despite the chaos he just quelled. Ruby watched, her breathing evening out, and whispered, She's not walking away from this, is she? Malcolm didn't look up. No, he said simply. She's not. Back in the rear, Vanessa sank into a jump seat, her head in her hands, blood dripping onto her lap. Her chest heaved, her mind racing. How had it come to this? She'd handled hundreds of flights, turned away dozens of liars, kept order with an iron grip. But this time she'd misjudged. She'd seen a kid in a hoodie and decided he was nothing. Now she was the one reduced to nothing, and the man in the suit was rewriting her fate with every quiet word. The plane steadied, the turbulence fading, but the tension didn't. Passengers whispered, their voices a low hum of awe and fear. The businessman leaned toward his wife, muttering, He's the owner. She's finished. The wife nodded, her eyes on Malcolm, who wrapped Jaden's hand with practiced care. The drunk man stayed silent, his bravado drowned in the reality of who he'd challenged. The woman in 3A set her broken glass down, her hands shaking as she realized she'd witnessed history unfolding in seat 1A. Malcolm finished bandaging Jaden's hand, his touch firm but gentle. He stood, towering over the cabin once more, and spoke to no one in particular. This doesn't happen again, he said, his voice carrying to every corner. Not on my airline. He turned to the junior attendant, who hovered nearby, clutching the empty kit. Tell the captain to patch me through to the cockpit. I want a status update. She nodded, scurrying off, and Malcolm sat beside Jaden, his presence a shield against the lingering chaos. Vanessa in the back lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She'd heard him, every word, and the weight of it crushed her. She tried to run to the cockpit, to anywhere moments ago, banging on the locked door in a blind panic before collapsing back into the aisle. The crew had ignored her, their silence a condemnation louder than any shout. Now she sat alone, her uniform a mockery of the power she'd once wielded, her hands stained with her own blood and the consequences of her pride. Malcolm glanced at his son, then at Ruby, and finally down the aisle where Vanessa sat. His expression didn't change, but his mind churned. He'd built this airline from a single plane, fought through boardrooms and backstabbing to make it a name people trusted. He'd flown incognito on this flight, as he often did, to see how his people worked when they didn't know he was watching. And what he'd seen, what Vanessa had done to his son, wasn't just personal. It was a crack in everything he'd built, a failure he wouldn't let stand. He leaned toward Jaden, his voice softening. "You're stronger than she thought," he said. "Stronger than most of them." Jaden nodded, the pain in his hand dulling under his father's words. "Why didn't you tell me you were here?" he asked again, quieter now. Malcolm's eyes met his, steady and sure. "Because I wanted you to handle it your way first. And you did." The cabin phone buzzed, and the junior attendant handed it back to Malcolm. "Captain's on the line, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He took it, pressing it to his ear. "Brooks here. What's our status?" The captain's voice crackled through. "We're stable, sir. Weather's clearing. 30 minutes. Malcolm nodded. "Good. Keep her locked out of the cockpit. No one talks to her but me." He hung up, handing the phone back, and settled into the seat beside Jaden, his posture relaxed but his mind razor-sharp. The passengers watched in silence, their earlier chaos replaced by a strange reverence. The drunk man slumped lower, his hands folded like a scolded child. The businessman whispered to himself. "He's rewriting the rulebook right now." The woman in 3A leaned forward, catching Ruby's eye. "Your nephew's lucky to have him," she said softly. Ruby nodded, wiping blood from her face. "He's lucky to be him," she replied. Vanessa in the back stared at her hands, the blood drying into dark streaks. Her head throbbed, her pride bled out, and the realization sank in. She'd lost everything in a single reckless moment. She'd seen a kid in a hoodie and decided he was a fraud. Now the man in the suit was proving her wrong, and the whole world would know it. The plane hummed beneath her, steady now, but for her it was already crashing. Malcolm rested a hand on Jaden's shoulder, his touch a quiet promise. "When we land," he said, "this ends. For her. And for anyone who thinks like her." Jaden nodded, his burned hand throbbing but his resolve hardening. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing. His father was here, and the storm was about to break wide open. The plane's engines whined down as it rolled to a stop at Gate 12, the jet bridge locking into place with a mechanical thud that reverberated through the cabin. The air inside was thick with tension, a stew of spilled liquor, drying blood, and the unspoken weight of what had just unfolded. Jaden Brooks sat in 1A, his burned hand wrapped in gauze, the pain a dull throb beneath his father's careful bandaging. His hoodie was stained with coffee, his curls damp with sweat, but his eyes were steady now, fixed on the exit ahead. Beside him, Ruby adjusted her posture, wincing as she pressed a fresh napkin to her temple, the blood there crusting into a dark line. Malcolm Brooks sat next to his son, his suit still pristine, his posture calm but unyielding, a king who just reclaimed his throne. Vanessa slumped in the back jump seat, her uniform a ruin of stains and tears, her blonde hair streaked with blood that had dried into a grotesque mask across her forehead. Her hands trembled in her lap, her breath shallow and uneven, her eyes darting toward the front where Malcolm's silhouette loomed like a guillotine blade. The cabin was silent, the usual post-landing chatter replaced by a heavy stillness. No one reached for their bags. No one stood. They waited, eyes flicking between the boy in 1A, the man beside him, and the woman who'd turned their flight into a nightmare. The seatbelt sign dinged off, a hollow sound in the quiet, and the cabin door hissed open. Outside, the jet bridge framed three figures, two uniformed security officers in crisp navy, their radios crackling, and a man in a dark blazer, his clipboard clutched like a shield. The passengers shifted, a murmur rippling through the rows, but Malcolm didn't move. He leaned toward Jaden, his voice low. "When we walk out, head straight for the car. No stops. No words." Jaden nodded, his throat tight. Ruby met Malcolm's gaze, her expression weary but resolute. "What about you?" she asked. Malcolm's eyes hardened. "I'm staying until this is done." The junior flight attendant, still pale from the ordeal, stepped forward hesitantly, her voice barely audible. Sir, they're here for her. She glanced toward Vanessa, who flinched at the words. Malcolm nodded once, then stood, his height filling the aisle. He turned to face the cabin, his presence commanding silence without a word. Anyone who saw this, he said, his voice steady, knows what happened. You don't need to say it now. But you'll be asked later. His gaze swept over them, the businessman in 2C, his phone now stashed, the woman in 3A, her broken glass abandoned, the drunk in 4C, sober and shrinking. They nodded, some reluctantly, some with guilt etching their faces. The man in the blazer stepped into the cabin, his voice clipped and professional. Mr. Brooks, I'm Daniel Carter, operations manager. We've got security and legal on site per your request. He glanced at Vanessa, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. Miss Dawson, you're being escorted off this flight under executive directive. Please stand and cooperate. Vanessa's head jerked up, her lips parting in a silent protest, but no sound came. She pushed herself up, her legs wobbling, and one of the officers stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on his belt. Ma'am, let's go, he said, his tone firm but not cruel. She stumbled into the aisle, her heels catching on the carpet, and the cabin watched as she passed, the woman who'd ruled first class with an iron fist now reduced to a staggering figure, her name tag glinting dully under the lights. Jaden didn't turn, but he felt her presence, the faint whiff of her floral perfume cutting through the stench of gin. The memory of her hand on his collar, the coffee searing his skin, flared hot in his mind, but he stayed still, his father's words anchoring him. Vanessa reached the door, her head low, and the officers flanked her, guiding her onto the jet bridge. A murmur followed her exit, soft but electric, like static after a storm. Malcolm motioned to Ruby. Take him out now. She nodded, helping Jaden to his feet. He winced as his burned hand brushed the armrest, but he straightened, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. The passengers parted silently as they moved down the aisle, a strange reverence in their stillness. The woman in 3A caught Jaden's eye, her voice soft. I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner. He paused, then nodded faintly. It's okay, he said, though it wasn't not really. Ruby guided him forward, her arm around his shoulders, shielding him from the stairs. Outside, the jet bridge was a tunnel of cool air and echoing footsteps. At its end, a wall of glass doors opened to the terminal, where flashes erupted like gunfire cameras, microphones, a swarm of reporters shouting questions that blurred into noise. Mr. Brooks, what happened up there? Is it true a flight attendant attacked a passenger? Malcolm's black SUV idled just beyond, its tinted windows a promise of escape. Security cleared a path and Ruby hustled Jaden through, his hoodie pulled up against the chaos. He slid into the back seat, Ruby beside him, and the door slammed shut, muffling the clamor. The driver pulled away, tires humming against the tarmac, and Jaden exhaled, the first breath he'd taken without pain in hours. Back on the plane, Malcolm remained, his arms crossed as Daniel briefed him. Legal's pulling footage now, Daniel said, flipping through his clipboard. Passenger statements are being collected. She's suspended pending review, but given the video evidence, he trailed off, meeting Malcolm's gaze. It's airtight, sir. Malcolm nodded, his jaw tight. Good. I want her personnel file on my desk by morning. Every infraction, every complaint. This wasn't her first mistake, it was just the one I saw. The drunk man, still in 4C, stood unsteadily, his voice slurring but quieter now. I didn't mean no harm, sir. Just thought she had a point. Malcolm turned, his eyes narrowing. You thought wrong, he said, his tone cutting through the man's haze. Sit down and hope I don't pull your ticket history next. The man sank back, his face red, and the cabin fell silent again. Daniel hesitated, then added, Press is all over this. We've got a statement ready, incident under investigation, safety paramount, but they'll want more. Malcolm shook his head. No statements yet. Let the footage speak. Words don't fix this until we do. Daniel nodded, scribbling a note, and stepped aside as the remaining passengers began to disembark, their whispers trailing behind them like smoke. In the terminal, Vanessa sat in a stark, windowless office near the staff wing. Her hands cuffed loosely in front of her precaution, the officers had said, given her earlier attempt to flee to the cockpit. Her head throbbed, the cut stitched hastily by a medic, and her uniform hung off her like a shed skin. Across from her, an HR rep, a woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense stare, slid a report across the table. "Miss Dawson," she began, her voice even, "you've been relieved of duty effective immediately. The board will review this, but with witness accounts and video, reinstatement isn't likely." Vanessa stared at the report, her vision blurring. "I didn't know who he was," she whispered, her voice cracking. The rep raised an eyebrow. "That's not the issue. You assaulted a passenger ticketed, verified, innocent based on your own assumptions. That's not a mistake. That's a choice." Vanessa's hands clenched, the cuffs clinking softly. "I thought I was protecting the cabin," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. The rep slid another paper forward, an email from Malcolm, timestamped minutes ago. "He asked you to see this," she said. Vanessa read it, her breath catching. "She doesn't owe me an apology. She owes my son his dignity. She took it. Now she pays." The words stung, sharper than the pain in her head, and she lowered the paper, her eyes burning. She didn't cry, not yet, but the tears were there, pooling silently at the edges. Outside, the black SUV rolled through the city, the skyline blurring past Jaden's window. He stared at the gauze on his hand, the pain a distant ache now, dulled by exhaustion. Ruby watched him, her own injuries forgotten. "You scared me up there," she said softly. He managed a faint smile. "You scared me more." She chuckled, then sobered. "Your dad, he's not letting this go, is he?" Jaden shook his head. "No. He won't." Malcolm stepped off the plane last, the cabin empty behind him, a battlefield cleared of its wounded. Daniel walked beside him, updating him quietly. "Security's got her in custody. Legal's drafting a full report. PR's on edge, but we're holding the line." Malcolm nodded, his eyes on the terminal ahead, where the press still buzzed like flies on a corpse. "Tell them to wait," he said. "This isn't about spin. It's about accountability." He paused at the jet bridge's end, glancing back at seat 1, a Jaden's seat, now vacant but marked by the coffee stain on the cushion, the torn ticket scrap still scattered on the floor. He'd built this airline for moments like this, for people like his son to rise above the noise. Vanessa had tried to take that away, and she'd failed. But the silence of the others, the passengers who watched, the crew who froze, gnawed at him. That too would change. In the car, Jaden leaned against the window, the city lights streaking past. "What's gonna happen to her?" he asked, his voice small. Malcolm's voice came from the front, steady as ever. "She's done here. Lost her job, maybe more. Depends on her." Jaden nodded, then added, "She looks so sure of herself. Like she'd done it before." Ruby's jaw tightened. "She probably has," she said. "Not with her hands maybe, but with her eyes." Malcolm glanced at his son in the rearview mirror. "She picked the wrong kid this time," he said. "And the wrong father." The car turned onto a quiet street, the airport fading behind them, but the weight of the day lingered, heavy and unresolved. Vanessa sat alone in that cold office, the HR rep's words echoing in her skull. She'd lost everything, her badge, her pride, her certainty, and the boy in 1A had taken it all without raising a fist. The terminal buzzed with rumors, the press circling, but inside the SUV, silence set lead a fragile peace before the storm's next wave. Jaden closed his eyes, the burn on his hand a reminder of what he'd endured, and what he'd survived. Malcolm drove on, his mind already mapping the reckoning ahead, knowing this was just the beginning. The city skyline glittered beyond the tinted windows of Malcolm's SUV, a mosaic of light stretching into the night as the vehicle wound its way through quiet streets. Inside, the silence was a living thing, soft, heavy, earned. Jaden Brooks leaned against the back seat, his burned hand resting on his lap, the gauze stark against his coffee-stained hoodie. The pain had dulled to a faint pulse, but the weight of the day clung to him like damp cloth, seeping into his bones. Ruby sat beside him, her temple cleaned but bruised, her eyes fixed on the passing streets, a quiet strength in her stillness. Malcolm drove, his hands steady on the wheel, his suit jacket draped over the passenger seat, the only sign he'd shed any armor after the battle in the sky. No one spoke. The hum of the engine filled the space, a steady rhythm that matched the city's pulse outside. Jaden's mind replayed flashes of the flight, Vanessa's sneer, the rip of his ticket, the searing coffee, his father's voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. He glanced at Malcolm's reflection in the rearview mirror, catching the faintest crease of concentration on his father's brow. "What's going to happen now?" Jaden asked, his voice breaking the silence, small but steady. Malcolm's eyes flicked to him, then back to the road. "She's done," he said, his tone flat but final. "Lost her job, her batch. Legal's reviewing it, call be more if we push." He paused, then added, "But that's not the end. This doesn't stop with her." Jaden nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of the gauze. "She looked so sure," he said softly, "like she'd done it before and gotten away with it." Ruby's jaw tightened, her voice low. "She probably has. Not with a slap maybe, but with a look, a word. People like her don't change until they're forced to." Malcolm's grip on the wheel tightened, just enough to betray the storm beneath his calm. "She picked the wrong fight this time," he said. "The wrong kid. The wrong father." The SUV turned into a gated driveway, the iron bars swinging open with a soft creak, and the house loomed a modern fortress of glass and stone, its lights warm against the dark. They stepped inside, the housekeeper taking their coats with a murmured greeting, and Jaden headed upstairs, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He paused at the landing, turning back. "Dad." Malcolm looked up. "I want to go to school tomorrow." "Normal. No car, no fuss." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Jaden nodded. "Yeah. I don't want this to define me." Malcolm held his gaze, then gave a single nod. "All right. Bus it is." But the driver follows discreetly. Jaden sighed but didn't argue, disappearing up the stairs. Ruby watched him go, then turned to Malcolm as they settled in the living room. "He's tougher than he looks," she said, easing onto the couch. Malcolm sank into an armchair, staring at the ceiling. "He shouldn't have to be," he replied, his voice quieter now, laced with something raw. "Not for this." Across town, Vanessa Dawson sat alone in her dim apartment, the blinds drawn tight, the air stale with the scent of untouched coffee cooling on the counter. Her uniform hung over a chair, its navy fabric wrinkled and stained, her name tag discarded on the table like a shed skin. Her head throbbed, the stitches from the airport medic pulling tight against her scalp, but the pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache in her chest. She stared at her laptop, the screen glowing with an email she drafted hours ago, unsent. Subject to Jaden Brooks. The words blurred as she read them again. "I didn't see you. I saw what I wanted to see, a kid who didn't fit. I was wrong. I took your piece and I'm sorry. It's not enough, but it's all I have." Her finger hovered over the send button, trembling. What if he didn't care? What if it was too late? She closed her eyes, the memory of Malcolm's voice. "She owes my son his dignity," cutting through her like glass. She pressed send, the click of the mouse a gunshot in the silence, and leaned back, her breath catching. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't even close. But it was a start, a crack in the armor she'd worn too long. Morning broke with a pale sky, the city stirring under a thin layer of spring mist. At the Brooks home, Ruby packed Jaden's lunch in the kitchen, the TV murmuring in the background, news anchors dissecting the flight, the headline stark. Airline CEO's son assaulted in first class. Attendant suspended. Jaden laced his sneakers by the stairs, his hoodie swapped for a fresh one, his headphones dangling around his neck. Malcolm stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching his son. "Bus leaves in 10, he said. Jaden nodded, grabbing his bag. "I'll be fine," he said and stepped out, the door closing softly behind him. At school, the air buzzed with whispers as he walked the halls, heads turning, eyes lingering. A kid near his locker, a sophomore with a buzz cut, stepped up. "Saw you on the news, man. That was wild." Jaden shrugged, opening his locker. "Yeah, it happened." The kid grinned. "You didn't even flinch." "Respect." Jaden managed a small smile. "Thanks." Inside his locker, he found a note from Ruby slipped in that morning. "You're not what they think. You're more. Keep going." He folded it, tucking it into his pocket, and headed to class, the whispers fading behind him. Back at the airline's headquarters, Malcolm stood in a glass-walled boardroom, the city sprawling below. Executives sat around a polished table, their faces tight as the legal team briefed them. "Footage is conclusive," a lawyer said, sliding a tablet across. "Assault? Negligence, bias all documented. She's out, union or not." Malcolm nodded, his arms crossed. "It's not just her," he said, his voice cutting through the room. "It's the system that let her think this was normal. We fixed that." The HR director spoke up, her voice measured. "We've drafted a policy overhaul, training, audits, a direct reporting line to the board. It's called the Jaden Brooks Protocol." Malcolm's eyes flickered, but he didn't flinch. "Approve it," he said. "And make it mandatory. Every crew member, every flight. No exceptions." The room nodded, papers rustling, and Malcolm turned to the window, his mind on his son riding a bus through the city, refusing to hide. Weeks passed, the headlines fading but the story sinking deep. The Jaden Brooks Protocol rolled out training sessions packed with real scenarios, including his own, dissected in uncomfortable detail. Flight attendants shifted in their seats as facilitators asked, "Why didn't anyone stop her?" No one had answers, but the silence was the point. Malcolm watched the first session from behind tinted glass, his expression unreadable, then walked away, knowing change wasn't words, it was action. At school, Jaden found his rhythm again, the stares softening into normalcy. One day, a seventh grader named Marcus approached him at lunch, nervous but determined. "I saw what happened," he said. "People tell me I don't belong in honors classes 'cause I don't look the part." Felt familiar. Jaden nodded, his voice steady. "Don't let them decide who you are. You're there because you earned it." Marcus smiled, walking off with a little more swagger, and Jaden felt something shift, not pride, but purpose. That evening he found an email on his phone, the sender's name stopping his breath. Vanessa Dawson. He read it in his room, the moonlight spilling across his desk, her words raw and unpolished. "I've watched the videos, read the stories. None of them caught how calm you were. I lost everything because I didn't see you. I hope you get back what I took." He read it twice, then closed it, leaving it unanswered. It didn't erase the burn, the humiliation, but it settled something, a quiet understanding that she'd faced her mirror, even if he didn't need to hold it for her. Months later, spring bloomed fully, the city alive with green and gold. Malcolm stood on his office balcony, a photo of Jaden at a school forum, microphone in hand, head high in his phone. He declined an award that week, telling Ruby, "I don't get medals for fixing my own mess." She'd smiled, her hand on his. "You fixed it for more than just him." Upstairs, Jaden pinned the forum badge to his wall, not for show, but as a reminder. It turned a slap into a voice. Vanessa, in her small apartment, started a new job: retail, no uniform, no power. She'd sent her email and let it go, the weightlifting just enough to breathe. The airline hummed on, its crews trained under Jaden's name. A silent promise etched into every flight. No one would be judged by a glance again. And Jaden, walking to the bus each morning, carried no anger, just a quiet strength, knowing he'd changed the sky without ever leaving the ground. And there you have it, Jaden Brooks, the kid who turned a slap into a revolution. Vanessa Dawson, the flight attendant who learned the hard way that pride comes with a crash landing. And Malcolm, the dad who didn't just own the airline but owned the moment. The plane's long gone, but the echoes of that flight still ripple through the skies today. Think about it. Next time you're buckling into 1 hour, let's be real, 23B with a screaming toddler behind you. Simeon's watching. Trained under Jaden's name, making sure you're not judged by your hoodie or your hustle. That's the legacy of a 19-year-old who stayed calm when the coffee hit the fan. Now let's bring this down to earth, your Earth 2025, where we're all just trying to survive Wi-Fi outages and overpriced airport pretzels. Ever been side-eyed at a coffee shop because your sneakers don't scream VIP? Or maybe you've been the Vanessa, quick to judge the guy in line with a ripped backpack, only to find out he's got a PhD and a better playlist than you. We've all got our blind spots. Mine's thinking I can board a flight without forgetting my charger. Point is, this story's not just about a plane, it's about us. Jaden didn't fight back with fists, she fought with presence. And that's a lesson worth more than a first-class upgrade. Here's the kicker, delivered with a wink. Vanessa thought she was the queen of the cabin, but she forgot the golden rule: don't mess with the kid whose dad owns the castle. It's like picking a fight with the barista only to realize they're secretly the coffee shop owner. Life's got a way of flipping the script, folks, so maybe next time, check the ticket before you tear it up, or at least don't spill the coffee. The takeaway? Judge less, listen more, and you might avoid a turbulence-sized mess in your own story. So, I've got questions for you. Drop them in the comments because I'm nosy like that. Ever had a moment where someone underestimated you and got served a reality check? Or been stuck on a flight with drama so thick you wished you'd packed popcorn? Spill the tea, pun intended, and let's swap stories. Where are you watching from today? New York? Tokyo? Your couch with a cat on your lap? Tell me, and let's connect over the chaos we all survive. Oh, and one last thing, didn't fly off without hitting that subscribe button. This channel's packed with stories like Jaden's, raw, real, and ready to make you laugh, think, and maybe cry into your boarding pass. Tap the bell, stick around, and let's keep the journey going. Your support keeps these tales airborne. So join the crew, we got more skies to conquer together.